In 1879, the unsettling news of a missing teacher shook Victorian Britain to its core. The press dubbed it the Barnes Mystery, and it was a case that sent a wave of fear through London's middle classes when they realised that an imposter may have been living among them. The events were so disturbing that the newspapers gave the culprit a chilling nickname, the female Sweeney Todd. For over a century, one vital piece of the mystery remained missing until it resurfaced in the most unexpected of places, Sir David Attenborough's garden. This is the true story of Kate Webster, the life-swapping Victorian maid who stole the identity of her employer in the most unthinkable way. Please note, this video explores historical crimes and is intended for educational and documentary purposes. It contains non-graphic discussion of tragic real-life events that are already publicly available. Viewer discretion is advised. Kate was born Catherine Lawler in 1849 in Killane, County Wexford, Ireland. Her early life wasn't easy. Like many at the time, her family and community were still struggling with the effects of Ireland's Great Potato Famine, which spanned from 1845 to 1852. The famine caused widespread starvation and disease across the country, and by 1901, it's estimated that over 1 million people had tragically lost their lives, and more than 1 million others had fled Ireland in search of a new life abroad. It was a devastating chapter in Irish history, one that reshaped the nation's future both socially and economically. Despite Kate coming from a good, honest family, she was known for getting up to no good, and from an early age she had fallen into a life of deception and petty crime. She started using the name Kate Webster after claiming she had married a sea captain and had 4 kids with him. But this story seems highly unlikely, especially as she picked up and moved to Liverpool when she was just 18, after eventually stealing enough to buy a ferry ticket. Once she arrived in Liverpool, with no real plan or means to support herself, she continued to steal and pickpocket to get by. However, she wasn't very good at being a career criminal and was almost instantly caught and given a 4-year sentence for larceny. She got out of prison around age 21 and travelled to London, where she found work as a charlady. A charlady, or charwoman, is an Old English term for someone who's hired on a temporary or part-time basis to clean houses or offices. But her earnings weren't enough to make ends meet, and she continued to steal and commit crime, resulting in her constantly being in and out of prison, serving multiple terms for larceny. She continued to move around London, switching jobs and changing names regularly, using the aliases Lawler, Webb, and Gibbs in an attempt to get away with her actions. She then moved to Notting Hill to work as a cook and housekeeper for a man named Captain Walbest, and that's where she met a man named Strong. Kate and Strong started a relationship and she moved in with him, quickly becoming pregnant and giving birth to a son in 1847, who she named John. But the happy home and family life didn't last for long, as after she gave birth, Strong swiftly left, abandoning Kate and their baby to fend for themselves. With no other support or assistance available at the time, she carried on with her dishonest and criminal lifestyle, often having to leave her young son in the care of her friend and fellow charwoman Sarah Crease, while she served a string of small sentences. At the end of January 1879, Kate Webster moved again, this time to Richmond, a nice quiet area in outer London. Here she began working as a housekeeper for a woman called Julia Martha Thomas. Julia was a widowed retired schoolteacher who lived alone in her semi-detached Richmond home since her husband passed away 6 years earlier. She was described by her doctor and neighbours as being a small, well-dressed lady about 54 years in age who was intelligent, eccentric and liked to travel. She'd been married twice in total and had been left a sizable inheritance for a comfortable lifestyle. However, she wasn't extremely wealthy and was technically part of the Victorian lower middle class. She'd often try to appear wealthier than she was, always dressing smartly and wearing lots of jewellery. But the one thing she felt she was lacking, and therefore stopping her from reaching the upper middle class status that she desired, was that she didn't have any staff. Julia longed to have a housekeeper, someone she could rely on, especially now that she was getting older. She wanted the company and hoped it would free up her time so that she could travel and visit friends and family more often, elevating her lifestyle as well as her status. But there was one issue standing between Julia and her dreams of domestic bliss. It seemed she'd garnered a reputation as not being quite the best employer. It was said that Julia Martha Thomas wasn't an easy woman to work for. She'd treat her staff harshly, was a perfectionist, and was very vocal with her criticisms. This resulted in past employees being fired or quitting shortly after starting, and after word got around, Julia struggled to find staff who'd work for her. Those with good references and plenty of options would steer well clear, finding better opportunities elsewhere. And that's when Kate Webster entered Julia's life. She applied to be a housekeeper, and Julia hired her immediately with no questions asked or background checks. At the start, Kate and Julia initially got along okay, but it didn't take long for things to deteriorate. As you can imagine from Kate's record, she wasn't the best or most qualified housekeeper. There was no glowing list of references or previous employers she hadn't deceived or left disappointed. It wasn't her housekeeping skills she'd been relying on, but her criminal activity, so it didn't take long for Julia to start noticing and picking her up on her many mistakes. Julia would follow Kate around, hovering over her shoulder as she cleaned the house, quick to point out her flaws and correct her, often interrupting to show her how to do it properly. Before long, tensions between the two women were high. Kate Webster had never been fond of being told what to do or having to work hard for a living. And Julia quickly began to loathe Kate's bad attitude, shoddy housekeeping, and unacceptable behaviour. She found Webster to be lazy, unprofessional, and unladylike. But what she found most intolerable was how Kate would spend as much time as she could in a nearby pub called the Hole in the Wall. Webster would disappear for hours on end and stumble back to Julia's in no fit state to work. For Julia, who was a regular churchgoer and had high hopes of mingling amongst the upper classes, this was not the type of person or image that she wanted to associate herself with. And just a month after Kate Webster took on her role of housekeeper, Julia couldn't handle the stress anymore and gave Webster notice that she was ending her employment, asking her to leave by Friday. However, when Friday rolled around and Kate hadn't been able to find a new job or anywhere else to live, she begged Julia to let her stay for the weekend. And Julia reluctantly agreed to allow her to continue working there until Monday, a decision that she'd go on to regret. On Sunday, Kate Webster left to go and visit her son, who was still being cared for by her friend, Sarah Crease. She was supposed to be back before Julia needed to go to her evening church service. But selfishly, Kate decided to stop at the pub on her way home, causing Julia to be late for church. Onlookers later described that during the service, Julia looked anxious and unsettled. She likely didn't trust Webster in her home and likely feared that she would try to rob her before the end of her employment tomorrow. So, Julia decided to leave church before the end of the service and she hurried home. That was the last time that anyone would see Julia Martha Thomas. Kate Webster had reached the end of the line. It was Sunday evening, she'd been drinking, she'd been scolded for making Julia late for church, and she knew that she had to leave tomorrow, with no job, no money, and nowhere else to go. Usually, she'd simply go back to stealing and move on, but there was something about Julia and her home that Kate just couldn't seem to let go of. No one can say for sure what led to the events that followed. Maybe it was Julia's vulnerability as a lone widow. Or was it the way she nagged and badgered her staff? Or maybe Kate Webster was just too jealous of the life and luxuries that Julia had. Whatever was going through Webster's mind, she appeared to have little intention of returning to the life of poverty and hardship that was waiting for her. When Monday morning rolled around, Julia Martha Thomas was nowhere to be seen. And Kate Webster didn't leave the property like she was supposed to. Instead, she carried on working, spending all Monday and Tuesday cooking and cleaning the house. A neighbour later reported a strange smell coming from Julia's home that was later determined to be from whatever Webster was cooking that day. Word also spread that Kate Webster had tried to sell a mysterious fatty substance as dripping or lard to the local pubs and neighbours. Dripping is the fat produced from roast meat and was widely used at the time, even being spread over bread and eaten cold like butter. Then, not content with just staying in her home uninvited, Kate went upstairs into Julia's room and started rummaging through her wardrobes, before slipping off her scruffy old char lady uniform and swapping it for one of Julia's lovely silk dresses. She then travelled to Hammersmith, where she'd lived previously, and visited some old friends. That's when Kate Webster turned up on the doorstep of Henry Porter and his son Robert. They were surprised to see the woman they used to know as a poor char lady standing in front of them holding a large black bag and wearing unusually fine clothing. When they asked her about her new wealthy appearance, she informed them that she'd inherited the contents of a house in Richmond from a relative. She then asked them if they knew anyone who'd be interested in buying the furniture, as she wanted to sell everything and move back to Ireland. She also claimed that she had married a man with the surname Thomas, presumably to explain why she was now using Julia's second name. Kate then said she was going to visit another friend and that she'd be back in a little while. But when she returned to Henry and Robert, they couldn't help but notice that Webster no longer had the black bag that she'd been carrying earlier. They remembered because they'd all helped carry it at various points throughout the day as the three of them walked around and visited multiple pubs, both noting that it was unusually heavy. Later on, Kate Webster asked Robert to assist her with a task, and she took him back to Julia's home in Richmond. Once there, Kate told Robert that she needed his help to carry a wooden box. It was so large and heavy that they each had to grab a side, and together they slowly walked with it to the nearby Richmond Bridge. This is where she told Robert to leave and go on without her, as someone else was meeting her here to collect the box. But as Robert walked away, he said that he heard a loud splash that sounded like something heavy hitting the water just shortly before Webster caught up with him. She then informed him that the meeting went well and the box had been collected. Once back at Henry Porter's, she continued to pester him over finding someone to buy Julia's furniture, so he introduced her to Mr. John Church, a publican and trader who she quickly befriended. Kate Webster became friendly with John Church. They started visiting pubs together, and eventually, on the 9th of March, she persuaded him to buy the furniture in Julia's home and even some of her clothes, for the agreed price of £68, around £7,000 in today's money, giving Kate £11 in advance, an amount that she was very pleased with. Everything seemed to be working out perfectly for Webster, who was having fun spending her newfound wealth and dressing in fancy clothing, mostly whilst visiting the local pubs. But something was stopping her from fully being able to enjoy herself. On the outside, she looked happier than she'd ever done. She had money for nice meals, no longer dressed in rags, and she'd escaped a life of financial hardship. But on the inside, she was nervous and filled with dread. Because what Kate was also aware of, while she was waltzing around posing as Mrs. Thomas, a media storm had swept across London with a story so big she couldn't ignore it. On March 5th, just one day after Kate Webster had asked Robert to help her carry the box, it was discovered about 5 miles downstream from where he'd heard the splash. The large wooden box had washed into the shallow waters under the Barnes Railway Bridge, where it was spotted by coal porter Henry Wheatley as he was driving by. Mr. Wheatley had first thought that it might contain stolen goods or something valuable, but what he discovered when he opened that sodden wooden box would haunt him for the rest of his days. And after the shock, he immediately contacted police. What they found inside horrified even the detectives. They arrived on scene quickly, carefully transporting the box and its contained evidence to be examined by investigators and a doctor. Inside, wrapped in brown paper, they discovered what appeared to be human remains. Disturbingly, several parts were missing, including the head and a foot, which made identification very difficult. Around the same time, not far away in Twickenham, the missing foot had also been discovered in a rubbish pile. The police did their best, but with no clear idea of the victim's identity beyond being female. They had few leads to go on, and the investigation started to go cold almost as soon as it had begun. The press, on the other hand, knew this was big news and started referring to the case as the Barnes mystery. Before long, it was in every newspaper and being talked about all over London. Kate Webster had been continuing her charade for 2 weeks, wearing Julia's nice clothes and expensive jewellery, spending the money she made by selling her things in the local pubs. Despite what was plastered all over the news, Kate thought that she was getting away with it. Neighbours weren't immediately aware that Julia Thomas had gone missing. She was known to travel often, and Kate did her best to make the home look as normal as possible, assuming her employer's identity and dealing with tradesmen, deliveries and callers as if she were Julia. But after Mrs. Thomas had missed a few sessions of church without letting anyone know where she was, people started to talk and began to question her whereabouts. On the 18th of March, Mr. John Church and his removal team arrived to collect the furniture and items that he had previously purchased. But this caught the attention of Julia's next-door neighbour and landlady, Miss Ives. Miss Ives saw the horse and cart outside and hastily ran out to ask them what they were doing and why they were there. When the movers explained that they were here to collect the furniture, Miss Ives asked who had instructed them to do this. They replied Mrs. Thompson, but indicated to Kate Webster. John Church then started searching through the items they had loaded into the car and discovered a letter written to the real Mrs. Thomas. Realizing that Miss Ives and Mr. Church likely figured out that she was up to something, Kate immediately fled the property. Taking her son and getting straight on a train to Liverpool, they then boarded a coal steamer and returned to her uncle's farm in Ireland. It wasn't just Julia's friends and neighbours who'd grown suspicious over Kate Webster's behaviour, but Henry and Robert Porter had worries too. After Robert read the news in the paper, he told his father, Henry, about the mysterious wooden box Kate had gotten him to carry. and how he believed that he had heard her throw it in the river. Concerned about the roles they'd unwittingly played and the trouble they could get into, they, around the same time as John Church and Miss Ives, also contacted the police. Detectives searched Julia's home, and what they discovered inside shocked them to the core. Investigators found bloodstains in various parts of the house, along with what appeared to be small charred fragments in the hearth, later suspected to be bone. They also uncovered an unusual fatty substance around the copper, a machine used for boiling laundry. It was this strange greasy substance that Webster was rumoured to have attempted to sell to locals as dripping and tubs of lard. However, there's no evidence to suggest that this happened, and it was likely just gossip stemming from the shocking news. Scotland Yard immediately put out a wanted notice on Kate Webster and her son. Shortly after, they discovered that she'd returned to Ireland, and working together with the Royal Irish Constabulary, they identified Kate as the same person who they'd previously imprisoned for larceny 14 years prior. This gave them all the information that they needed. On the 29th of March, 1879, Kate Webster was arrested at her uncle's farm, where she'd been hiding from the authorities, and was taken back to Richmond to face what she'd done. On March 30th, at Richmond Police Station, Kate Webster gave a statement and was formally charged with murder. In her statement, she attempted to pass the blame onto Mr. John Church, who she had previously sold Julia's furniture to, claiming that he had conspired with others to get at the contents of her employer's home, and the poor man was arrested and charged with murder alongside her. Fortunately for Mr. Church, he had a solid alibi, and had also been one of the people to assist police uncover Webster's crimes, so the charges against him were dropped at the committal hearing. Webster, however, was remanded in custody and transferred to Newgate Prison to await her trial. The public and media went into overdrive. The case was so huge that before the trial had even begun, Madame Two-Swords created a waxwork of Kate Webster, calling her the Richmond Murderess and placing her in their Chamber of Horrors exhibit next to the like of Burke and Hare, and later Jack the Ripper and George Joseph Smith, who was featured in our previous video, The Edwardian Tinder Swindler. The public just couldn't get their heads around the fact that a woman had done these things, or that she'd dared to act against someone of a higher social class than herself. It swept fear through the upper classes in Victorian society, who struggled to accept that the workers they bring into their home may be a danger to them. They also couldn't believe that Webster had managed to pull off the act of living amongst them for 2 weeks, going unnoticed to those she interacted with whilst posing as Mrs. Thomas. They were shocked to realise that as long as someone wears the right clothes, they're often accepted as middle class, without much fault to their character or how they earned their way in life. It rocked trust in the local community and caused a stir across the Victorian class system. The case was so big that the trial took place at the Central Criminal Court, now known as the Old Bailey. The courtroom was packed, overflowing with crowds of people outside, queuing for hours to get in each day. Kate Webster's trial began on the 2nd of July, 1879. Henry Porter and his son Robert gave evidence in the trial, detailing how they'd unknowingly been involved, to which Webster's defense tried to use to shift blame onto them. Fortunately, the judge summarized that both Henry and his son had alibis and were of known good character, based on their past actions as well as helping police in their initial investigations. Sarah Creese, Kate's friend and the woman who regularly cared for her son, gave evidence in Kate's defense. Along with another friend, they both described her as being of a good nature. One of the most difficult tasks the prosecution had was proving that the remains actually belonged to Julia Thomas. As the head still hadn't been found, her true identity was hard to determine. Then a bonnet maker came forward to give evidence. She told the court that on the 25th of February, 6 days before Julia disappeared, Kate had told her that she was soon going to Birmingham to collect an inheritance left to her by an aunt who'd recently passed away. The prosecution claimed that this was clear evidence of premeditation. On the 8th of July 1879, after a 6-day trial, the jury took just over an hour to find Webster guilty. Before she was sentenced, she was asked if she had anything to say, to which she said that John Church and the Porters had no involvement. She then again denied the charges against her. Webster then proceeded to claim that she was pregnant. To determine if she was telling the truth, a surgeon, along with a group of 12 matrons, who were chosen from the women present in the courtroom, were tasked with investigating. They left the court and went into a private room to examine her. I don't know what methods they used or how accurate they were, but they concluded that she wasn't with child, and Webster was taken to Wandsworth Prison and guarded around the clock by a team of female guards. Whilst awaiting her execution, Kate made a confession, this time placing the blame at the hands of her ex-partner and the father of her son, Strong, claiming that he was the one who introduced her to a life of crime and that he was involved, but again her words were found to be baseless. Finally, after resigning herself to her fate, Webster made what is believed to be her most honest confession and accurate telling of the events that took place after Julia Thomas left church on the 2nd of March 1879. Here is some of what she said, quoted from Webster's statement. Mrs. Thomas came in and went upstairs. I went up after her and we had an argument, which ripened into a quarrel. And in the height of my anger and rage, I threw her from the top of the stairs to the ground floor. She had a heavy fall, and I became agitated at what had occurred, lost all control of myself, and to prevent her screaming and getting me into trouble, I caught her by the throat, and in the struggle and I threw her to the floor. I prepared the copper with water to boil and burned up as much of the parts as I could. The night before Webster's death, she made one final confession with her solicitor and a priest present, where she took sole responsibility for her crimes. She also stated that she was resigned to her fate and that she would almost rather be executed than return to a life of misery and deception. At 9 a.m. on Tuesday, the 29th of July, 1879, Kate Webster was executed by hanging at Wandsworth Prison and buried in an unmarked grave in one of the prison yards. The day after, an auction was held at Julia's property to sell the contents of her home. Mr. John Church attended and went ahead and purchased some of the furniture he originally intended to buy. However, he also bought some of Julia's personal items, including her pocket watch, and perhaps most disturbingly, he bought the sharp implement that Kate had used when carrying out her crimes. I don't know why he'd want to own such an awful item, but he wanted to buy it. Even the copper in which Kate had used to boil her employer was sold at the auction for 5 shillings. People even took pebbles from the garden just to own something from the now infamous house. After Kate's death, authorities tried to get her uncle to take care of her son. but the case had caused just as much uproar over in Ireland as it had in England, and appalled by her crimes, he refused. This meant that Kate's son John was sent to live at a workhouse until a place could be found for him at an industrial school. He'd no doubt have a difficult life ahead of him and likely struggled to distance himself from his mother's reputation. But Julia Martha Thomas's story didn't end there. For over a century, one vital piece of the Barnes mystery still remained missing, until it resurfaced in the most unexpected place, Sir David Attenborough's garden. In October 2010, the legendary British TV presenter and natural historian Sir David Attenborough purchased a hole-in-the-wall pub where Webster would frequently visit back in 1879. During renovations, workmen excavating the back of the pub on the site of the pub stables made an astonishing discovery. Underneath foundations from the 1980s, they came across a layer of old Victorian tiles. On top of them, they found a dark circular object, which they soon discovered was a human skull. They immediately handed it over to the police, and through examination and carbon dating, they established that the skull had evidence of injury in line with the fall down the stairs that Webster described in her confession. It also had low collagen levels, which is consistent with it being boiled, just as Webster said she had done in the laundry copper. Finally, Julia Thomas and the Barnes mystery could be laid to rest. Thank you all for watching till the end. We spend weeks researching, writing and creating our videos, and it really means a lot to us when they're seen. If you could do us one small favour and please like and subscribe to the channel, that would really make a massive difference on our quest to reach our first 1,000 subscribers. I hope you found today's story interesting. Why do you think Kate did what she did? Was she a hardened criminal all along? Or was she also a victim of a time that had little help or empathy for a woman in her position? Let us know down in the comments. As always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.